Well, we traditionally end our sessions with a VC, angel, and dealmaker panel where we discuss just the VC issues and the VC trends and the tech trends. So that's what this panel is all about, and we've assembled this group of experts here, everyone from angel investors to VCs to lawyers to incubators, and even Jana here, who's here from the Kaufman Fellowship as well, and is now running the ANZ InnovyzSTART in Adelaide. I was just in Adelaide and saw their demo day on Monday and saw their spectacular group of entrepreneurs who were coming up. So maybe in the future when we're back here in Sydney, we'll have some of those entrepreneurs to showcase as well. But what are the major challenges that Australian startups face in scaling their businesses? Who'd like to start on that? This is just a Q&A format, very ad lib. No PowerPoint presentations. We don't believe in those. So what do you think are the major challenges that Australian startups face in scaling their businesses?
I'll start if you like. From a legal perspective, I think one of the challenges over in this country compared with the US is certainly our fundraising provisions, which are just not sympathetic towards companies looking to grow their businesses. It's one of the major challenges we have, and I think, sort of goes into even to the equity crowdfunding opportunities that are out there as well. Our rules are just very prohibitive. What we need is to, introduce legislation like the Jobs Act in the US, where we encourage, people to actually assist, these exciting companies which are, trying to change the landscape in this country, and it's just not happening. And I think CAMEC are looking for reforms. The submission's due sort of 30th November, and our firm sort of certainly working hard with some groups to try and convince government to introduce that sort of legislation into this country. Is that one better? Okay. So yeah, really the sort of the ability for companies to raise funds is very problematic in this country, and it needs to change. It's as simple as that. Also with the way in which we encourage, our employees in part of these companies, again, the rules over here are just not sympathetic like they are in the EU.
Is there a change coming?
There's been a change coming for about 10 years. We've lobbied government through various organisations, and they're talking about reforms in 2014, but let's see what happens there. But I think everyone in the community over here really needs to really continue to push hard on government to make those changes.
So I'll answer the question from a different point of view, or just a little bit different aspect of it. So I just wanted to go back to one thing that was asked earlier about why Blackbird invested in Canva. And I would say a couple things. One is because Melanie and Cliff had a big vision. They also had been successful before as entrepreneurs. And there was two other things. We like to, excuse the profanity, we like to invest in people who can get shit done and give a shit. And they were them. But from a scaling point of view, I don't view it as in some ways you can look at Atlassian's business, and if you're talking about scaling the business itself and not the fundraising, they've sort of broken the mold in a lot of ways in terms of scaling it. And I think with the internet and broadband and all of the things that we know, that you are now able to scale a business from Australia if your business is of that ilk. And so for Canva, most of the customer acquisition will be through online and online forums and things of that nature. So no longer do you have these physical barriers that are going to hold you back. It really is all about, are you expert at acquiring customers online? Can you do it at a cost that is reasonable? And is your product an absolute delight to work with? And if you have those things, then you have a chance.
I think following up from just what you've said, Bill, the idea of Australians having a big vision is important. The number of pictures that I've heard from people saying, well, the Australian market's 20 million. Well, that's fantastic. But if you look at the number of people within that 20 million who actually use your product, well, it's going to be far less than the 20 million. And therefore, for Australian entrepreneurs, for founders to think about a problem that is difficult, and this difficult problem that many people around the world outside of Australia are going to need to solve, and hopefully solve with their product. I think that is the exciting thing, and therefore being able to use the power of the internet to bring customers on board, whatever they're selling.
Yeah, and to maximise the value of that, I think one of the traps that Australian entrepreneurs sometimes fall into is looking at the Australian market, which, as Ben said, is small, and so you tend to try to use it as a test market without being focused. What that ends up meaning is that you build all these features that are responsive to individual customer needs without having any real focus on what the larger markets are around the world. So when you then go into a bigger market, you've got this fully featured product that's been developed to address the Australian market, which is very fragmented, and you've often burnt a lot of cash building those features which nobody else actually cares about. So I think to scale, you need to have focus. You need to be able to interpret what you've learned from the Australian market to refine that focus, but then still looking towards those larger markets around the world where what you're building here in Australia and improving here in Australia will have that global reach.
Just add one thing. Nobody cares if you're from Australia. I mean, nobody gives a crap. I mean, all they want to know is that the product works. I mean, any of us who use an American or European product, we don't care that the company's in Europe or they're American. It's ridiculous. You just care that the product is fantastic and it solves your problem. So this insular looking of, oh, we're from Australia, we can't do it, is just a load of BS. And you see a number of companies like Atlassian, like Seek, like Big Commerce. All of these companies have broken this mold. They just, the world is now connected. So get over it. We're connected, and build a fantastic product that everybody wants to use.
I'm sort of the American in Australia, so it's been fascinating to come. I also was in on the very ground floor of the Kaufman Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership, where we did the groundbreaking research on companies and how to start them, how to grow them. So I've been able to sort of bring all that and to look at what's going on in Australia. And I think there's several things. I can't do anything about the taxation, the regulation, or the legislation, but there are things that we can do about. One is you learn to scale by seeing other people who have scaled, who talk about it. So you get over the tall poppy syndrome, you get into the standing up here and talking. Right back now in Adelaide, 2 entrepreneurs are doing something that we called Entrepreneurs Get Real, about what it really takes to grow a company. Second, you talk about growth. You don't just talk about startup where you have a whole lot of people doing their individual thing. That's great. That's the first step. But then we talk about adding people, creating a culture, talking about markets, learning to sell, learning to get out in the world, and thinking big with the big vision. So we have several things that we have to do in terms of the mindset and the knowledge that entrepreneurs themselves need. And then we have some things to do about the ecosystem, which I'm sure you'll ask us about as well.
Okay. So I'm getting the idea that maybe Australian entrepreneurs have an inferiority complex. Is it true?
I'm not one, so I can't.
No.
Yeah, I think Hamish is right. I think the answer is no. I don't think they have an inferiority complex. I just don't think that they, and this is changing because this is the newest entrepreneurs have no inferiority complex, and none at all. And I don't think that everybody here is as smart as anybody else in the world. The software engineering here is just awesome. It's world class. The country is as expert at wireless as anybody in the world. So why is there an inferiority complex? I don't think that's the correct sort of categorization. I just think that sometimes it's a little bit, as Benjamin said, it's a little bit, we're only 20 million people. So I don't think it's inferiority. I think it's just thinking too small in some cases.
Why is there a shortage of capital to fund startups here in Australia?
Yeah.
Again, I'm the outsider. So what I see is a country full of people who are willing to take risks, as in putting money in a hole in the ground, but they don't know how to assess the risk of a young entrepreneur actually creating a company. And I think there's a great opportunity. With every problem is an opportunity, great opportunity to do education and educating people about how do you look at companies, how do you be a good angel investor, how do you do due diligence, and why it's important to do. And I think there have to be more of us, and I put myself in that category, where we're actually going out and talking about creating seed funds in different cities, as well as here in Sydney. And we're going to make capital available, because you have to have deals in order to have capital, but you won't get deals if we don't have the capital in the other end.
Yeah, there is a shortage of, historically there has been a real emphasis on primary industry in this country. I was in Perth earlier in the year with some startup people there, and the number of, I guess, entrepreneurs who have made money out of mining, who are prepared to back other entrepreneurs who are wanting to do something in mining, is very high. And then for me going there to try to convince them, well, how about technology? Some of them listened to me, a lot didn't. And I think a lot of this capital is unfortunately locked up in the success begets success cycle. And I think seeing some of these companies that we've heard about today actually hit the big time and get some real success will actually open some more money into the ecosystem, which will see other people who are following that money into the ecosystem. So I think to break that cycle, we sort of need to get some big winners and to celebrate those winners and to fate those winners and not cut them down like some Australians like to do.
What's the impact of these new Silicon Valley type investors who are entering the Australian market? What impact is that going to have on the local VCs and their deal making?
Well, most of the most of the Silicon Valley guys who come down here are only investing, at least at this point in time, into later stage businesses. So if you look at Atlassian raised $60 million when they had well north of $60 million in revenue. BigCommerce, they don't publicize their data, but they're probably sort of north of $25 million in revenue. And so Oz4X, 99 Designs, all of these companies generally had proven businesses, proven customer bases, and what you had is you had a number of the Silicon Valley firms come here and say, look, these are great businesses, and gee, no capital around here is willing to invest, so we will. Plus, they also had all the leverage that Silicon Valley has and the connections, et cetera. So I think the Silicon Valley firms will continue to come down here, which is a terrific thing, and invest in later stage businesses. Slowly, they'll creep down to the earlier stages. I think it will have nothing but a positive effect on the existing group. And look, from Blackbird's point of view, we're an early stage investor. We want to show the things that we're doing to the later stage investors now, so that we can get them interested and also so that they can track it. And we want to understand what they are interested in and how they look at things too, before we invest. So we use them in some ways as a little bit of a due diligence filter in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think we've got. So my experience of individuals investing in startup companies is based on my experience with Sydney Angels over the last 5 years, and increasingly people are getting more comfortable with some help and some assistance from those who have travelled before in being able to do due diligence and assess deal flow and make investments themselves, either themselves individually or as part of syndicates. So I think we are starting to see a little bit of activity and certainly a lot more investment activity from individuals. So it's not going to dramatically transform the balance away from speculative mining, but I think we're starting to see entrepreneurs and people who have been successful in business being comfortable investing into early stage technology companies. The real gap, though, is at that formal institutional investment stage. It is a very dire set of circumstances we have in Australia, where there are really very limited number of formal venture capital funds that are backed by traditional institutional investors. And having just spent some time at the Avcal conference this year, it's the message from the institutional investors, the superannuation funds, is that they're very skeptical on the success of early stage venture capital investing in Australia. Now that will change, because we all know the two motivating factors of any investor: fear, greed. Fear and greed. So the fear is overexpressing at the moment, but we see a successful exit of Atlassian. The successful IPO of Atlassian. We see some strong listings of IPO tech stocks. Suddenly the greed starts to stamp down that fear feeling, and we might actually see a little bit more of an acceptance that this is an asset class that needs capital at different stages. It's great having lots of angel investors, and that starts companies, but we need money to scale companies. And I think that the biggest benefit that our friends from Silicon Valley coming out here and cherry-picking great deals that have been de-risked is that maybe some of the institutional investors here will see that they've been missing out.
That is a good point. And we're also seeing some China VCs coming in as well, such as SoftBank. So that's another factor. David, from where you sit, do you think the valuations for deals are going to rise as a result of increased competition? Are the good picking days becoming smaller and smaller? And what do Australian entrepreneurs have realistic expectations for valuations?
Well, that's an easy question. Look, I think one of the issues with the Australian, all of Australia, particularly from an ASX perspective, I've taken a number of US companies and listed them down here, and valuation has always been one of the issues that's always floated around, whether we get true value in Australia for whatever we do, from a public markets perspective or a private market perspective. The sense I get is that we're really at an inflection point in Australia at the moment around valuations for growth companies like we're talking about. I think there are opportunities to really get full value for the businesses. I think it's all about confidence from my perspective. And you're seeing Twitter, I think it's priced at $26, goes tomorrow, and the book build was around 23 to 25, so that's a positive. We keep seeing sort of results like that, even though they're offshore. That should help drive onshore opportunities from a valuation perspective as well. So I think I don't want to get too far ahead of myself with this, but I think we should see better valuations coming through, is my sense. The global economy is improving. Certainly from our platform, as a law firm, we interact with companies in all the major countries. Talk a lot to the guys in our office in the Valley. They're sort of seeing better valuations coming through as well. So, from my perspective, I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to see a better trend around valuations, both globally but also in Australia.
And I think also you are, even though traditionally the ASX has lacked kind of an understanding of technology companies. If you look at Xero, for instance, this is amazing. What is their market cap now? 2 point something billion, and they got revenues of 30 something. So you'd be hard pressed to find an equivalent company on you could probably find an equivalent company on NASDAQ, but I think that at least the ASX, at least with this particular company, is pricing technology companies as well as anywhere in the world at the moment. Whether that's you see what Matt Berry is doing with Freelancer, and so hopefully the ASX will be a viable platform for IPOs in the future. I hope so. From a venture investor's point of view, look, the valuations in Australia are very similar to, maybe slightly below what they are in Silicon Valley, but not much, because that information about what is a company is, what's a traditional Series A, what's a seed, what's a B, it's all transparent. It's all, you can find it anywhere. So that information, where it used to be a lot harder to find out, you can now look up anything, and so it's all there.
Yeah. I'd say on the ASX have been actively courting the tech community. They have been holding lunches for people to list their tech companies, but they've also been going to places like China and inviting some Chinese companies to list on the local bourse. And I think there was one which recently listed, which is selling prepaid cards, and revenue's very thin, but their market cap is into the hundreds. So yes, they do see the Australian bourse as a way to get some liquidity for their stock. What I'd say though, if I put my Sydney seed fund cap on at the lower end of the market, there needs to be a realisation of, when people are going to raise money, what stage is the business at? If people are coming in with not even a prototype and asking for a $5 million pre-money valuation, well, I think Bill and I would which smile, because it comes down to what traction has been made, and pre-prototype, it's very difficult to show that traction. But even once you have your prototype, what runs do you have on the board to be able to justify that sort of valuation? And is the problem that you're trying to solve for big enough for you to go for that sort of number?
It's perhaps been a little bit of the heritage of speculative investing in Australia. You know, we've come from a very much a advisor-led or promoter-led culture, which tended to mean that the person actually investing wouldn't necessarily be part of the valuation question. So I think there was a period of time where people would just accept the valuation that was given to them and do very limited due diligence themselves, apart from on whether it was a trusted source that the deal came from. I think that led to some distortions in the way that things were valued. What we're seeing now, though, is that I think as we start to see people more confident in doing a little bit of due diligence themselves, and the fact that we have this information that's a little bit more transparent now, that some of the really wacko valuations that we used to see are not happening anymore. So we're coming back to the norm, which I think is a very good thing, because the disastrous investments that often result in people leaving the market after dabbling are the ones where they overpay. And I think we can all count both seed investments that are done at ridiculous valuations where angel investors get washed out when venture guys come along. Likewise with venture people that come in and think that there's a nice up to the right graph for that valuation that disappears when a more serious Series B investor comes along. And even in the public market, stuff that's priced too high on listing and then in tanks doesn't do anybody any good. So I think actually people are being more realistic about leaving some money on the table. We can certainly see that perhaps with Freelancer. You know, and I think if there's some uplift for everybody who comes after those that came before, then everyone's going to be really happy.
Yeah, actually part of what I was going to say, I agree entirely. I think just one observation I make, though, about the ASX is that we've sort of dual listed some US companies down here, and their observation is that the ASX is much more forgiving for companies that actually don't meet their targets. Now, we don't want to be missing targets, but that is interesting from a valuation perspective, that the maintenance of valuation actually is a little bit more stable over here. Maybe not for the right reasons, but certainly investors over here are more forgiving. I think that comment before about we've been used to investing in mining companies that have sort of spiked and troughed pretty quickly, that there is a bit more of an understanding that there is a life cycle to these companies.
So I'll be on the side of the entrepreneur, because we've just had 10 companies that have come out. And so the issue for them is now they're going off and presenting to angels. And one of the angels came up to me and said, "Gee, Jana, I hope you've really knocked some sense into them in terms of valuations." And I said, "Well, why is that?" Well, first of all, we selected 10 out of a large pool. And secondly, we've driven out the risk because we've made sure that there's a concept that makes sense. Third, they've worked with 30 people as mentors over the 13 weeks. Fourth, they understand and they've been taught what they need to do to grow. And fifth, they have a product now where we have some traction. So why wouldn't their valuations be higher than the normal dude that you'd see that comes in off the street? So it's the education of both sides in terms of where is value, where do you look for value, where do you look for better deals, and indeed the valuation should be higher for people who have gone through that kind of a process.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the real positive signs that we're seeing here in the Australian startup market, is there are a number of incubators and accelerators and co-working spaces. And that's all very positive, and I think will help to boost the entire ecosystem. I would like to turn a little bit to technology, the technology markets. Are there any particular areas that Australian startups have an advantage in? E-commerce, digital media, life science, you name it. Hamish, let me start with you, because I know you represent a lot of life science companies.
So there's certainly a strong growth in the tech sector, the software sector, but I think if we look at where Australia has traditionally had some amazing strengths, certainly one area in the life sciences is the medical device sector. If we think about ResMed and Cochlear as being global leaders in their field, those two companies really emerged from this core group of amazing biomedical engineers that came out of the Nucleus group. Anybody here know the name Paul Traynor? Yeah, so look him up. I think he is the most outstanding Australian entrepreneur that nobody knows. So founder of the Nucleus Group. The Nucleus Group was a group of biomedical engineers that created the world's first implantable defibrillator. Little known fact, created a group of companies that were experts and leaders in the global medical device sector, and spawned this little small company called Cochlear that created the first bionic ear. So out of that, we've seen this heritage of great researchers, great entrepreneurs, a track record of successful companies, and this was all sort of late 80s, early 90s, and so now we're into 2011, 12, 13, and we're starting to see the people who have been through the Nucleus mafia, just like the PayPal mafia, coming through again and creating great medical device businesses. So I think that's one area that doesn't get a lot of press, but it's certainly an area where if you track the heritage of any of the current batch of medical device startup companies, there's always a direct lineage back to the Nucleus group. So that's one area. The other area is in traditional biotechnology, and I'm glad to see Nuclone there, Russell Howard, and Noel Sundstrom. So biotechnology, I think, is something that's always a challenge in the Australian market because we're a small local market. But we've got these amazing scientists and researchers that have come out of this depth of hardcore research that we have in Australia. And we also have some dedicated venture capital funds here that fund the development of life science businesses. Again, it doesn't necessarily get on TechCrunch or in the newspaper, but we've got some great businesses here that are commercializing wonderful technology. And because we've got this homegrown talent, we don't have this war for programmers that end up going over to the Valley to work for Facebook. We've got any number of great researchers and scientists to go and work for our startup companies. So that's my two plugs: medical devices and biotechnology.
And I think you heard from the guys at Atlassian. I mean, Alan Noble from Google, I think, manages 350 engineers 2 meters down the road. Atlassian has probably the same equivalent. So software engineering is very, very strong in Australia. Always has been. Many people, it's funny, you speak to many people in Silicon Valley and you say, Wi-Fi was actually invented in Marsfield, which is a suburb of Sydney, and they, what are you talking about? So, one of the world's greatest 802.11 standards in wireless communications was just invented up the road here. So there's great expertise in wireless as well. So there's a number of core competencies, I think, that are very, very strong here. And a lot of it comes from, well, I don't know where it comes from, but a lot of it has to do with the university system being strong in certain areas. And so, look, I think if you look around the world, and you can also see that there are many Australians who are in key companies around the world, in key places. Mick Johnson runs all of mobile Facebook, and he used to work at Sensory Networks. For Matt Berry came out. He was the gold medal winner out of the University of Sydney. So there's lots of guys like that around the world.
Is it smart for an Australian technology company to leverage the Silicon Valley connections and set up a presence in Silicon Valley, or maybe China or Hong Kong or Singapore, and tap into their technology expertise or R&D or lower cost? Is that a good strategy or not?
I certainly have 10 companies asking me that at the moment. Should I go to Silicon Valley right away? I guess my advice to companies always has been, before you go into another country, find a good partner who can open doors, introduce you, and whether or not that's a customer or a sales rep or a VC or whatever. You don't sort of get off the plane and say, hey, I'm here. Don't you want to do business with me? That's what they would do in New Zealand when we first started working with them on the 321 Go Global program. They just kind of landed and thought it would all happen. So finding partners, finding people who can introduce you to the right people, or getting all those set up before you go over, I think is absolutely essential. But if we can't find the funds here, and we think it's a great product that has globally relevant, as all of ours are, breakthrough solutions, then we have to go where the money is.
My first question is why? Why are you considering another market? I think it's important to go to where your customers are. If you're not in the same time zone as your customers, it's very difficult to service them. If you're selling enterprise and you need to get feedback from customers and you cannot see them, well, it makes sense to be close to them. So my big question is, why do you want to actually go into those markets? And I think for us in Australia, we have this tremendous advantage at being in the same time zone as a very large growing in wealth population. So the ability for us, I think, to leverage the population to our north, whose GDP per capita is increasing at a rapid rate each year, I think presents a huge opportunity. At the same time, there are challenges. There are challenges to do with language. There's challenges to do with culture. There's challenges to do with whether people there will want to use the product in the same way we use that product. But I think we do have a unique opportunity here to leverage the friendships that we have developed with many of our Asian neighbours over the last probably, since the Colombo plan, since the 60s, where you've had Asian scholars come to Australia, study at Australian universities, and either stay here or go back home. And I think the ability for Australians to leverage those friendships, those relationships, I think is going to bear much fruit for those who take advantage.
I remember in my first book, Silicon Dragon, one of the companies that I profile was Suntech, Chinese solar power company, which was at one point the world's largest Chinese solar power company globally. But the R&D came from Australia, and the CEO is originally from Australia. So there you go. I'd also like to ask, I was reading about Murdoch's comments about Australia's vision, or his vision for Australia and the whole entrepreneurial journey, and whether disruptive technology is a future path for Australia. What's your view on what is the future path for Australian business? Is the tech economy or do you agree with Murdoch's comments? Let's just go down the panelists and ask.
I should have moved places. Look, I think, from my perspective, that technology will play an important part in this country, but it will not be the dominant player. I mean, I think this country has a very long history in primary industry, and that's not going to go away in a hurry. You know, the resources boom may not be what it was, but it's still a very strong part of this economy, and will continue to be so. There's many other aspects of the economy. To look at the Wales government coming out and saying what are going to be the key 5 sectors, and technology's there, but it's not not just technology. So I think an important part, an increasing important part, great opportunities, but it's not going to be the be and end all for this country.
So I would have a slightly different slant on that. I think we're up here because we're in the technology business. There is an interesting sort of a shift that's happening. I can see from a mindset point of view, and it's evident in the room today. So, James Alexander and Alex Stamp back here are both former students of University of Sydney. Alex has a startup. James runs the incubator at University of Sydney, and for the first time over the past sort of 3 or 4 years, you're now seeing students who are coming out of the university going, I don't want to go to work for accounting firm X or bank Y. They say, I want to start a business. And so I think that you have this sea change mentality of all of the younger folks who are coming out of university. I think you have as much talent as you have anywhere in the world. And while we may not surpass the primary industry or the agricultural business for some time, I think it's going to become a much, much bigger part of the GDP. And so that's my hope anyways.
Definitely. I was fortunate earlier this year to go up to Brisbane, where there was the NBN conference. And at the NBN conference, there were folks from academia, from science labs, from industry, who were looking at all sorts of interesting ways to deploy technology with the benefit of fast internet. And I think seeing some of the new kinds of applications that are possible because of I don't know whether it'll be 100 megabits, maybe it'll be 50 now, but fast internet, I think was very exciting for me, especially seeing folks who were from rural and regional areas being connected, and the applications by way of agricultural, by way of agriculture and health for those people. So I'm bullish.
I think I'm bullish. I'm also so certainly the economy, the structural parts of the economy with the I guess the dominance of primary industries, resources, etc., is still pretty hard to ignore. However, I don't think anybody in this room would say that that's going to stay the same. You know, it's really, it is going to. We're going to see the growth in other sectors and the diminishing of the resource sector over time. And so I think if I want to get my crystal ball out and say where is the growth in technology going to come from that's particularly relevant to Australia, that's going to create that economic growth. And I guess I'm always a little bit, I guess because I have a short attention span, I'm always thinking about where the areas of disruption are likely to come from. And that's always at the intersection of markets that are boring. So I think if we want to get a crystal ball out, I think we look at where do we think are going to be the really amazing developments of technology from the intersection of, say, the creative industries and digital technology. Creative industries and technology is an area I'm super excited about. Because we think about, Australia's got these amazingly creative people. The creative industries as a sector is still largely service-based, still is really hard to see how it's going to scale, yet it's where many of our really, really smart people are. You apply technology to that, and suddenly you have scalable business models. You take a business model that's been developed and proven in another market, and you deploy that into the creative sector, enabled by technology. Suddenly you have these amazing businesses. So I think, I don't know what they're going to be, but that's where I think we're going to see some of this growth in the dominance of the new economy. Taking the amazing creative content that we make here in Australia, enable it with technology to reach a global audience, a business model that supports it, to monetize it. Boom.
Boom. How can I follow that? Boom. So when you think about what happened again in the States when we moved from an extractive society to a knowledge economy, it really had to do with the infrastructure. So you went from having everything transported on rivers to then having it on roads and railroads and then airplanes, and now we have the NBN. So that's incredibly exciting. I know what happened in rural areas when we put in all that stuff in the state. So I think that's going to be huge. I think they're going to be creativity and people that don't even know how to think, and they won't be hampered by all the things that we thought of. But I think that technology is going to be the backbone. And when you look at the value of technology jobs, ICT jobs, they're like a multiplier of 4. So if you're planning an economy, if you're a public policy person, don't you want to go for industries where there's huge turnover of more jobs created by this one job that you create, as in restaurants, dry cleaners, people who sell cars and so forth, as opposed to just a single job to do a single task. So I think we've got to think of both the multiplier effect, and we have to use this amazing backbone of technology that we're now developing here, working in a global economy where so many more people from Australia are from around the world. What, 237 countries represented. Gosh, you know, I could spend all day driving through the Midwest and hardly see anybody else there but a Midwesterner. So I think we have a huge advantage here in being able to go global, because there's so many representatives who are from the global community. So the technology, the creativity, the new infrastructure backbone, and the representativeness of the population here, I think it's going to be amazing what's going to happen here. In fact, it's probably one of the reasons why I am here.
That's great. I think we've heard a lot of disruptive ideas, and we've seen a lot of disruptive thinking here. And what do you think? Let's give them a round of applause. Well, thank you, everyone. How many other people smell food like I do? I think it's time for us to turn to our cocktail reception next. And thank you, everyone, for being here. If you like this event, let me know, because we may be back next year. So thank you very much.